I told my parents I was done, and they told me I was overreacting. 3 months later, I packed up my daughter and left the province without telling them where we were going. I used to think families had a way of finding their balance. That even when things got bad, really bad, the people who raised you would eventually choose you. Not perfectly, not without fumbling, but in the moments that counted, they would put themselves aside long enough to see what was actually happening. I held on to that belief longer than I should have. It cost me more than I want to calculate. My name doesn't matter as much as the story. But the story matters, so I'll tell it. My parents, I'll call them my father and my mother because that's the role they occupied, even when they failed it, raised 2 sons in a small city in Ontario. My younger brother, whom I'll call by the name he gave himself every time he wanted to start over, Kieran. And me. Kieran was 4 years younger, and, from the time he could talk, he had a gift. Not for anything particular. Just for making people feel like helping him was the most natural thing in the world. He had this way of looking at you after he'd done something wrong. Not guilty, exactly. More like confused that you were upset, and somehow you'd end up apologizing to him. My parents called it charm. I called it what it was, but not until much later. I was the reliable one. Good grades, part-time job at 16, moved out at 22 to take a position with an engineering firm in Hamilton. By 27 I'd bought a small house, nothing impressive, a 3-bedroom semi-detached with a backyard that flooded in spring. But it was mine. I'd saved the down payment myself, navigated the mortgage myself, and done it quietly, without asking for anything. Around that same time, I met my wife. We were together for 2 years before we got married, and for a while, everything felt settled. We had a daughter, Rosie. Born when I was 30. She came into the world in the middle of a February snowstorm, which felt appropriate. Stubborn entry. Clear-eyed from the start. She had my stubbornness and my wife's laugh, which is both the best and most exhausting combination I can imagine. Kieran came to the hospital when Rosie was born. He held her for about 40 seconds, took a photo, and then spent the next hour telling my parents about a business idea he was developing. That was Kieran. He could be present and absent in the same room. For years, things moved the way they do when you're busy, fast, a little blurred at the edges, and you don't stop to question what you're actually looking at, because you're just trying to keep your footing. I worked. My wife worked. We raised Rosie. My brother borrowed money he didn't repay and showed up at family dinners with a different explanation, each time for why things hadn't panned out. My parents subsidized him quietly. Sometimes not so quietly, and I said nothing because saying something always became a conversation about how Kieran was trying, how I needed to be patient, how family means more than money. I was patient. For years, I was patient. What broke it wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a Tuesday afternoon phone call from my mother in April. She started with, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm." In my experience, nothing good follows that sentence. She told me she'd found out 2 weeks earlier. My wife and Kieran had been seeing each other. She didn't use those words exactly. She softened everything, the way she always did with anything involving Kieran. But that was what she meant. My wife and my brother had been having an affair. My mother had known for 2 weeks. She was telling me now because my wife had told her she was pregnant, and my mother felt I deserved to hear it from the family. I sat in my car in the parking garage at work, and did not speak for a long time. "Are you there?" my mother asked. "How long?" I said. She hesitated. "A few months, she thinks." "How long have you known?" Another pause. 2 weeks. Maybe a little longer. A little longer. I was trying to figure out the right way to "Was Dad there when she told you?" Silence, which was its own answer. I drove home. I don't remember most of the drive. I remember sitting in my driveway for a while before going inside, looking at the front door of a house I'd bought for a family that was apparently not what I'd understood it to be. I didn't yell. I've never been a yeller. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and when my wife came in and saw my face, she started crying before I said a word. "My mother called," I said. She sat down. She didn't deny it. She said she'd been trying to find the right time. She said she was scared. She said she didn't know how to tell me. She said a lot of things that were true, and that didn't change a single fact I was sitting with. "How long?" I asked. 6 months, she said. "Maybe closer to 7. I stood up. I went to check on Rosie, who was 3 at the time, asleep in her room with a stuffed moose tucked under her arm. My mother had given her the moose, which I remember registering and filing away for later. I sat on the edge of Rosie's bed for a few minutes. I looked at her face. Then I went back downstairs. "You should call your mother," my wife said. "Why?" "She's worried about you." I looked at her for a moment. She was worried enough to wait 2 weeks. That night I called my parents. My father answered. I said, "Did you know too?" He said, "Let's not do this over the phone." So I drove to their house. It took 40 minutes. They were both up, which told me they'd been waiting. My mother met me at the door looking like she'd been holding herself together through effort alone. My father stayed in the living room. I asked them how long. My father said a few weeks. I told him my mother had said, a little longer than 2 weeks when I pressed her. Neither of them contradicted me. We sat for a moment in that particular silence that families produce when everyone knows the truth, and no one wants to be the first to fully admit it. My mother said, "We didn't want to do more damage before we knew the whole picture." "Whose picture?" I said. "Mine? Or Kieran's?" My father's jaw tightened. He had always responded to guilt by becoming rigid. "Nobody is defending what happened here." "Good," I said. "Then, tell me whose side you're on." What followed was a 20-minute conversation that I remember in fragments. My mother cried. My father talked about the baby, about Rosie needing her family intact, about not wanting things to escalate. He used the phrase bigger picture at least 3 times. At some point he said something about how I was a strong person. How I'd always been the one who could handle things, and I want to remember that my hands were very still while he said it. Because what I felt underneath was not strength. It was the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent his whole life being told he can handle things because telling him that is easier than dealing with the problem. Then my mother said, "Kieran feels terrible. I think if the two of you could talk." "No," I said, "he's your brother. Right now I need you to stop talking about what Kieran feels." I looked at her. "I need you to tell me once, clearly, that you understand what has happened to me." She said my name. She reached for my hand. I stood up. "I'll call you when I'm ready," I said. And I left. For the next several days, I talked to a lawyer. I don't want to spend too long on the legal details because they're not the point, but they're not nothing either. In Ontario, when you're separating with a child involved, custody and support arrangements involve a lot of paperwork and a lot of patience. I had both. I retained a family lawyer the morning after the conversation at my parents' house, before I'd even filed anything, before I'd told anyone what I was planning. Rosie's welfare was documented. The history of my wife's relationship with my brother was documented. The environment Rosie had been living in, with my brother coming and going, was documented. What I did not do was tell Kieran any of this was coming. The temporary custody arrangement leaned in my direction because I'd prepared for it. My wife's instability during that period, not something I'm proud to say, but true, was a factor. Kieran was not considered a safe presence for Rosie, given the circumstances. My wife retained supervised visitation, and I moved Rosie out of the house before anyone realized we weren't coming back. I want to be clear about something. I did not disappear for revenge. I need whoever is reading this to understand that. I moved because the city we were in was also the city my parents lived in, and my parents had chosen, whether they understood the weight of that choice or not, to manage Kieran's fallout before managing my pain. I couldn't raise my daughter in proximity to that. It wasn't safe, not for her, and not for me. We moved to British Columbia, a small city on the island which I don't need to name. I found work with a firm there. I enrolled Rosie in a new daycare. I got us set up in a rental while I figured out what came next. I changed our lives carefully, the way you change something you don't want anyone to interfere with, before it's done. I blocked my parents' numbers for a while. Not permanently, not out of cruelty, because I needed quiet long enough to think. I gave Rosie a new normal before I let anything from the old one back in. The first few months, my mother's emails went unanswered. My father called from numbers I didn't recognize a few times before he stopped. Kieran tried texting from 3 different numbers in 2 days, which I reported and had blocked. My wife, ex-wife now, in all the ways that mattered, apparently told my mother we'd gone west, but not where exactly. That bought me a little more time. What I couldn't anticipate was how quiet it would make me feel. Not peaceful. Quiet in the way that happens when something loud has been removed from your life, and your ears are still ringing with the memory of it. I kept a simple life. Work. Rosie, a small circle of people who didn't know my history. Rosie started calling the moose my mother had given her Mudge. I have no idea why. Kids are like that, and she carried it everywhere, and I let her. Even though every time I saw it, I thought about that phone call in the parking garage. The pregnancy was Kieran's. They named the boy Fletcher. I know this because my mother eventually found a way to reach me through my firm's main line, and I took the call more out of surprise than readiness. She cried. She told me about the baby. She said Kieran was trying to be a good father. I said I was glad the baby was healthy, because it wasn't the baby's fault, and then I said I'd be in touch when I was ready, and I hung up. A year passed, then another one. Every year on Rosie's birthday, she was 4 when we moved, so she turned 5 in BC, then 6, then 7. I sent a photo to my parents. Not out of obligation. I don't know exactly why I did it. Maybe because I wanted them to know she was real and present and growing, and that they'd been part of something that was still ongoing, even if I wasn't standing in front of them to show them. The photos were plain. Rosie at the park. Rosie with a gap in her front teeth. Rosie with a project she'd built out of cardboard boxes that she claimed was a space station. No notes. Just the pictures. My mother wrote once to say she'd received the photo, and that Rosie looked wonderful. My father wrote once to say he was sorry. Not a big letter. Just, "I'm sorry. I know, that doesn't fix anything, Dad. I kept both emails. I didn't answer them. What I kept coming back to, in those quieter years, was a question my therapist asked me. I'd started seeing someone about 8 months after the move. A woman in her 50s who had a very irritating habit of letting silence do the work. She asked me once, "What did you need from your parents the night you went to their house?" I said I'd needed them to choose me. She let that sit for a bit. Then she said, "And what did choosing you look like?" I thought about it. Just once, I needed them to say, without looking for the asterisk, without calculating what it meant for Kieran, that what had been done to me was wrong. That they were on my side. That was it, that was all. She nodded. And they couldn't do it. They'd never had to before, I said. When Kieran was the problem, they managed the damage. They didn't take sides. They absorbed the impact for him and handed the rest of me. I remember thinking about that, for a long time after the session. I'd grown up being told I was the strong one, the independent one, the one who didn't need as much. And I'd believed it. I'd worn it like a badge. Never occurred to me that being described as someone who doesn't need much is also a way of saying your needs are inconvenient. Rosie was 6 when Kieran and my wife separated. My mother told me during one of her occasional emails she'd taken to writing once every few months, never asking for much, just maintaining a thread. Kieran had been struggling. He'd taken some money from a joint account before the separation was finalized, which created legal problems. He'd lost a contract job he'd had for less than a year. He was back living with my parents. I read this and felt two things simultaneously. The first was a tiredness so complete, it almost felt like sleep. The second was something colder. The recognition that my parents were back in the same position they'd always been in with Kieran, propping him up, and that nothing I had done or endured had changed their fundamental pattern. They would always soften for him. That was just who they were. But by that point, I had stopped expecting them to be different, which was different from forgiving them. Stopping an expectation and opting for forgiveness are not the same thing. My father had a health scare when Rosie was 8. My mother called. Actually called, not emailed, to tell me. He'd had some chest pains, they'd run tests, there was a valve issue that wasn't immediately dangerous but needed monitoring. He was on medication. He was slowing down. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, after she hung up. I thought about my father. He was not a warm man. He was functional, private, not particularly demonstrative. I had respected him more than I'd felt close to him, if that makes sense. But he was still my father, and hearing that his heart was doing something it shouldn't be doing, made me understand that the window for anything between us was not infinitely wide. I wrote him a letter. Paper, not email. It took me several attempts to get to something that felt true, rather than performed. The version I sent said, "Dad, I know there's probably a lot you want to say and a lot I want to say, and I don't think any of it is going to come out right on paper or over the phone. But I want you to know that I don't hate you. I wanted you to choose me, and you couldn't. I understand that better now than I did when I left. I don't know what comes next between us. But I didn't want you to not know that. Your son." He wrote back 6 weeks later. 2 paragraphs. In the second paragraph he said, "I told myself I was keeping the peace. I want you to know I understand now that keeping the peace, when one person has caused all the damage, is just covering for them. I covered for your brother your whole life, and I told myself I was being a good father. I wasn't. I was being a coward. I'm sorry." I read it maybe 4 times. Then I set it on the table and went to get Rosie from school, and on the walk home she told me at length about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend, over whose turn it was to name the class hamster. And I held her hand and listened, and I thought, this is what I protected. This is what was worth protecting. Something shifted after that. Slowly, not a reconciliation. I want to be careful with that word because it implies something was restored, and I don't think restoration is the right frame. What happened was more like a thaw. My father and I exchanged letters a few more times. My mother and I graduated from occasional emails to occasional phone calls, short ones, careful ones. She asked about Rosie. I answered. I didn't ask about Kieran. She didn't mention him unprompted, eventually. Rosie turned 9, then 10. She was asking questions by this point. Kids do, even when you try to keep things simple. She knew her mother and I weren't together. She knew we'd moved. She knew she had grandparents in Ontario that she didn't see. She asked once. With the directness that children produce without even realizing it, did Grandma and Grandpa do something wrong? I thought about how to answer that for a moment. They made some choices, I said, that made it hard for us to stay close to them. Did they say sorry? Yeah, I said, they did. She considered this. Did you forgive them? I said, I'm still working on it. She nodded, like that was a reasonable answer, which I appreciated. Rosie has always been better at accepting uncertainty than I am. The year Rosie turned 11, my father's heart condition worsened. He had a procedure done in Toronto. I know, because my mother called before and after, and I stayed on both calls longer than I had before. We didn't say much, but we stayed. He died in January the following year. He went quietly, at home, early in the morning. My mother called me at 6:30 and I answered on the second ring. I drove Rosie to school first, because that felt right, keeping her day intact while I figured out what mine was going to look like. Then I booked flights. The funeral was held at a church in the city where I grew up. I hadn't been back in years. The streets looked smaller than I remembered, which is a cliché but also just true. My mother looked smaller too. She stood by the door of the church greeting people, and when she saw me, she put both hands over her mouth for a moment before reaching for me. Kieran was there. He was thinner than I remembered, and older in a way that had less to do with years and more to do with the last few of them. He saw me before I saw him. He walked over with that particular energy he'd always carried. The energy of someone who has decided in advance that a conversation is going to go well because he needs it to. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. "You came." He was my father. Kieran nodded. His eyes were red. For a moment I thought he was going to say something about us, about everything, and I want to say I was prepared for that. But honestly I wasn't. I'd driven almost all day to be in that room and I hadn't thought far enough ahead. But what he said was, Fletcher wanted to send something. For Rosie. He doesn't know her but he knows about her. He made this. He held out a folded card, the kind an 8-year-old makes, with marker and stickers. Stitch. The outside said Rosie in crooked block letters. The inside said I hope you are good. From Fletcher. I took the card. I held it for a moment. The stickers were dinosaurs. "Thank you," I said. I meant it. That was the extent of it. We didn't reconcile. We didn't have a conversation about the years. We stood in the same room for our father's funeral, and that was enough for one day. Rosie didn't come to the service. She was staying with a neighbor's family we'd grown close to, another single parent who understood logistics. But after the burial, I called her from the parking lot. She asked how Grandma was doing. I said Grandma was sad but okay. She said, "Can I make her something to send?" And I said yes, and she spent that evening making a card with watercolor paint. I carried the card home and mailed it. My mother called when she got it. She cried. She told me Rosie had painted a picture of what she said were the yellow curtains she remembered from my parents' kitchen. She didn't remember them from her own life. She'd been too young when we left. But at some point I must have mentioned them, and she'd filed it away, the way kids do with things they sense matter. I don't know why that detail hit me the way it did. It just did. After the funeral, my mother and I found a rhythm. A real one, not just maintenance. She started calling on Sunday afternoons, and I started answering. She asked about Rosie. I asked about her health, her neighbors, the small routines she was rebuilding without my father. I did not ask about Kieran, but I stopped bracing every time his name came up, which was its own kind of progress. Rosie started writing to my mother on her own, which I hadn't encouraged or discouraged. Just letters, sometimes short, sometimes longer. She'd been in a phase of writing everything down that year, journals, lists, letters to people. My mother wrote back every time. She sent Rosie books, which Rosie loved with an intensity that I found both exhausting and wonderful. The first time Rosie asked if she could meet Grandma in person, she was 12. She asked matter-of-factly, like she was proposing a plan she'd been thinking about for a while. "I want to meet her," she said. "Can we go to Ontario?" I told her I'd think about it. I talked to my therapist, who was unhelpfully good at not telling me what to do. I talked to a friend here who knew enough of the history to give me a real answer. And then I called my mother and told her Rosie wanted to visit. My mother was very quiet on the phone. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I appreciated that she asked rather than assumed. I told her, Kieran would not be there. If he showed up, we'd leave. This was about Rosie and her, not about rebuilding everything at once. She said yes immediately, and she didn't argue about any of it, which was probably the most meaningful thing she could have done. We flew out in August. My mother met us at the airport, which meant I saw her face the moment she saw Rosie, and I want to remember that expression for the rest of my life. My daughter, who is not a physically demonstrative person as a rule, walked right up to my mother and hugged her. I watched my mother hold on just long enough, not too long, and then let go. On the second day my mother made pancakes in the kitchen with the yellow curtains, which are still there. Rosie looked at them once and then looked at me. I nodded. She smiled. We stayed for 4 days. We visited my father's grave, which was harder than I expected. Rosie held my hand. She put a small rock on the headstone. I have no idea where she got this habit, maybe from a book, and stood there for a moment in her quiet, serious way. On the last evenings I sat with my mother at the kitchen table after Rosie had gone to bed. We had tea. We talked about my father for a while. Really talked, not around him, and then for a while we didn't talk. Just sat there in the kitchen where I'd grown up, with the yellow curtains, and the sound of the refrigerator, and all the years between us that we hadn't managed to close. My mother said, "I was so afraid you'd never come back." I said, "I almost didn't." She nodded. "I know. Then. I should have called you the day Emily came to tell us. The same day. Before I called your brother, before I did anything else, I should have called you." I looked at my tea. "Yeah," I said. "You should have. I can't fix that, I know. But I want you to know I understand now. Exactly what I chose instead of you. I don't have a name for it except cowardice. I looked at her. She was older, smaller. The woman who had stood in the doorway of their house 20 years ago. When I was young, and the world seemed to run along sensible lines, felt like someone I'd known in a different version of my life. And maybe she was. And maybe I was someone different too. We're here, I said. That's what I've got right now. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. I let her. That was not forgiveness, not completely. I want to be honest about that. But it was something real and present, and I wasn't going to pretend. It wasn't the relationship my mother and I have now, is careful. She comes out west twice a year. She and Rosie have a thing where they read the same book, and then video call to talk about it. Which is not something I would have expected from either of them. But, there it is. Kieran is not part of our life. That's a line I haven't moved, and my mother doesn't ask me to. She understands, now, that protecting him and protecting me were never the same project, and that for too many years she treated them like they were. Rosie asked me last month if I was ever going to talk to her uncle. She's old enough now to ask things like that without needing to be shielded from the real answer. I said, I don't think so. Not anytime soon. She said, is that okay? Yeah, I said, it is. She seemed to accept this. She went back to whatever she was reading. Then she looked up and said, Dad, the thing you did leaving and starting over, that was pretty brave. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said it was necessary. She shrugged. Sometimes those are the same thing. She's 12. She says things like that. I've thought a lot about what I'd say to someone in the position I was in, sitting in a parking garage with their whole understanding of their family dissolving. I don't have a tidy answer. I don't think tidy answers belong to stories like this. 1. What I have is this: the people who raised you are not automatically on your side. Learning that is one of the harder educations available. But some of them, given enough time and enough honesty, find their way to the side they should have been on from the beginning. And that's not nothing. It's not everything. But it's not nothing. I drove Rosie to school this morning. She had a project she'd worked on all week. A model of a water treatment plant, built out of recycled materials, because her class is doing a unit on infrastructure. She carried it very carefully to the car, and then complained the whole drive that I was going over bumps, on purpose. I was not going over bumps on purpose. There are just a lot of bumps on our street. I watched her walk into the building, and I thought about a Tuesday afternoon phone call in a parking garage, and the years between that moment and this one. And my daughter carrying a water treatment plant through a set of school doors. And I thought, I made the right call. I moved on. Just not in the direction they had in mind.